She was 6 years old when they came for her. The priests arrived at dawn, white robes, solemn faces. They spoke to her father in hushed tones while her mother stood frozen in the doorway. When her father turned around, he was crying, but smiling. Crying and smiling at the same time in a way she'd never seen before. They told him she'd been chosen, selected from the girls of Rome. Not because she was the prettiest, not because she was the smartest, because the signs were right, the lineage acceptable, the body unmarked, the family useful, the city satisfied. They said the goddess Vesta herself had called her name. She would tend the sacred flame that kept the empire alive. She would become one of the 6 most holy women in the world. Her mother dressed her in white linen, braided her hair one last time, held her face between trembling hands, and whispered words she was too young to understand. Something about honor, something about duty, something about making them proud. Something that sounded like comfort but felt like goodbye. Then the priests took her hand and led her away. The temple of Vesta stood at the heart of Rome. Round, ancient, crowded with meaning. Inside burned a flame, Rome treated like a heartbeat. The fire didn't just warm the altar, it warmed the idea of Rome itself. People believed that as long as it lived, the city lived. That if it died, something larger than wood and ash would collapse. And now, this 6-year-old girl would spend the next 30 years of her life keeping it alive. 30 years. She couldn't count that high yet. They cut her hair, gave her new robes, taught her the prayers, explained the rules she would follow until she was old enough to leave. No men, no marriage, no touch. Her body belonged to the goddess now. Her purity was Rome's protection. They also explained the punishment. If she ever broke her vow, if her chastity was judged lost, if her sacred body was declared defiled, she would be taken to a small, underground chamber outside the honored city. They would give her a lamp, a loaf of bread, a cup of water. Then they would seal the entrance with stones and earth and leave her there. Rome couldn't shed a Vestal's blood. That would be sacrilege. So they let the earth do it instead, buried alive in the dark, waiting for the lamp to go out, waiting for the bread to run out, waiting for the air to run out. She learned this at 6 years old, learned to be terrified of her own body before she understood what her body was. But here's what no one told her. The real danger wouldn't come from her breaking a vow. The real danger would come from a man who didn't believe vows applied to him, a man who would become emperor, a man who saw sacred flesh as the ultimate conquest. His name was Nero, and what happened next is so shameful the surviving record is thin. One blunt line in Suetonius, and then silence. Whether that silence comes from fear, politics, or lost texts, we're left with fragments and a name. Rubria. Rome buried this story like a crime, sealed up and left in the dark. They hoped no one would ever dig it up. They hoped wrong. Before you understand what Nero damaged, you need to understand what the Vestal Virgins actually were. They weren't just priestesses. They weren't just holy women tending a flame. They were a state institution built out of religion, law, and fear, a public guarantee, a living symbol Rome paraded as proof that the gods still approved of its power. And Rome built its identity around protecting them. A Vestal Virgin walked through Rome like no other woman could. Lictors marched ahead of her, clearing the streets, the same honor given to magistrates, the same choreography given to authority. People moved aside the way they moved aside for men with rods and axes, not because she threatened them, but because the city was trained to treat her as untouchable. Tradition said that if a condemned prisoner encountered a Vestal on his way to execution, and she intervened, his fate could change. No trial, no appeal. Her presence itself was treated like a sign. Like the gods had stepped into the street and spoken through a woman Rome had decided was pure enough to be a vessel. They safeguarded Rome's most sensitive documents, important wills and state papers. Augustus is even said to have deposited his will with them. When Rome needed an unbreakable oath witnessed, they called the Vestals. When treaties required sacred witnesses, the Vestals signed them. Not because the Vestals commanded legions, because Rome believed their moral authority could hold a promise together when men couldn't. They sat in the imperial box at the games, front row, visible. The only women in Rome permitted to sit beside the emperor himself in that public display of violence and spectacle. Senators yielded seats when a Vestal approached. Generals lowered their eyes. Even men who thought themselves untouchable understood they were in the presence of something the law and the gods had fused into one. And that word mattered. Untouchable. Their bodies were legally sacrosanct. Harm a Vestal, and Rome could treat it like an attack on the state itself. In some traditions, even being in the wrong proximity to their litter carried severe penalties. The message was clear. Don't brush too close. Don't obstruct. Don't joke. Don't test it. If a man touched her deliberately, he was finished. If he violated her, the punishment didn't stop with him. His name erased, his property seized, his household destroyed. Because to Rome, that's exactly what it was. The Vestals embodied Roman civilization. Their purity represented the purity of the state. Their flame represented the life of the empire. When the fire burned bright, Rome prospered. When Rome feared famine, invasion, plague, betrayal, it looked at that flame like a patient looks at a pulse. Still going, still safe, still protected. Victory and virtue were bound together in white robes and eternal fire. This wasn't superstition to the Romans, this was survival. And that's why the punishment was so grotesque. Because Rome didn't punish a Vestal like a person, it punished a Vestal like a breach in a wall. A Vestal accused of losing chastity wasn't treated as a woman who loved, or a woman who was coerced, or a woman who was harmed. She was treated as a danger, a crack, a stain on the state, and stains on the sacred weren't debated, they were buried. So picture what Rome was truly doing when it took a girl at 6. It was taking her before she could become anything else, before she could belong to herself, before she could build a private life strong enough to compete with the institution. They didn't just give her rules, they gave her a new name for fear. They gave her a new relationship with her own skin. They trained her to treat her body not as a home, but as a liability. Something that could ruin Rome if it ever betrayed her. She grew up inside ritual. She learned to wake before dawn, to wash, to dress, to speak words she memorized before she understood their meaning, to keep her face still when people stared, to walk slowly, to move precisely, to never look like a girl. She learned that the temple didn't just belong to Vesta. The temple belonged to Rome, and Rome watched. Rome watched the Vestals the way a nervous man watches a lock. Not because it expects the lock to open on its own, because it fears what happens if it does. For centuries, the system held. Generations of sacred virgins keeping the flame alive, generations of men absorbing the lesson. Some boundaries could not be crossed. Some women could not be touched. Then Nero became emperor. And Nero didn't believe in boundaries, didn't believe anything existed beyond his reach, didn't believe the word untouchable applied to him. So how does an emperor violate something that cannot be violated? What twisted logic did he use to make the sacred feel available, to make the protected feel breakable? The answer reveals something darker than madness, something more calculated than insanity. Nero didn't break the rules, he rewrote reality. Nero had everything a human being could possess. Palaces that swallowed acres, gold enough to drown in, slaves in the thousands, artists, musicians, poets competing to be noticed. Every luxury the ancient world could offer lay at his feet before he turned 20. And women. Any woman in the empire was his for the taking. Senators' wives, foreign princesses, actresses and slaves and noblewomen. If Nero wanted her, Nero had her. No one could refuse. No one would dare. Refusal wasn't a moral stance. It was a death wish. But the Vestals were different. The Vestals existed outside his ordinary authority. Their bodies belonged to the goddess. Their chastity was protected by laws and customs older than the empire itself. Even the emperor, on paper, had a limit. And Nero could not tolerate limits. Ancient writers describe a man who believed praise was his birthright, who flew into rages when anyone suggested he wasn't the greatest singer, the greatest performer, the greatest charioteer who ever lived. Nero didn't just want admiration. He needed worship. And worship requires no boundaries between the god and his desire. That's what Nero became in his own mind, a god. He identified himself with Apollo, commissioned images that blurred emperor and deity, performed in theaters where audiences were pressured to stay because leaving was an insult. He treated applause like oxygen. He treated criticism like treason. And then Rome burned. The fire became part of the Nero myth because it fits his deeper pattern. A man who saw the world as a stage, tragedy as atmosphere, suffering as scenery. Whether every rumor around that fire is true or exaggerated, the fact that people believed them tells you what kind of emperor he was. A man who made Rome feel unsafe in its own skin. A man who made sacred things feel temporary. A man who made everyone learn the same lesson: nothing is protected if the one with power wants it. The Vestals became his obsession precisely because they were forbidden. Think about it. What challenge remains for a man who can have anything? What conquest matters when nothing resists? The Vestals were the last boundary, the final frontier of untouchable purity. And Nero's narcissism demanded he cross it, but he wasn't stupid. Mad, perhaps. Delusional, certainly, but not stupid. He understood Roman politics, understood that dragging a Vestal from her temple in chains would trigger riots. The people would revolt. The Senate would find courage in outrage. The Guard might hesitate. The Vestals were too beloved, too sacred, too central to Roman identity. Direct assault could destroy him before it satisfied him. So Nero found another way. If he couldn't take what he wanted through force, he would take it through performance. If violation was forbidden, he would dress violation in the robes of ritual. If desecration meant danger, he would make desecration look like something the city could be trained to accept. What we can say with certainty is simple and brutal. Suetonius claims Nero violated a Vestal Rubria. The details of how are not preserved. But Nero's court was a place where spectacle, religion, and power blurred. And it's in that blur that abuse can hide. What Nero created was worse than assault, worse than simple violence, because it wasn't just the act, it was the system around the act. He didn't need to write new laws. He only needed to turn power into a kind of liturgy, make the unspeakable feel official, and when an emperor is treated like a god, who dares to call it what it is? The ancient sources don't preserve the scene. Suetonius gives one blunt charge. Nero violated the Vestal Rubria, and then the record thins, but the fragments survive. And when you piece them together, the picture becomes clear, not as a single described event, but as a shape, a pattern, a sick logic. We don't have the scene, we don't have the script. We have one blunt accusation, and then the record goes quiet. And in Rome, silence around power was never proof that nothing happened. It was proof that someone had something to lose, because how could they refuse? In Nero's Rome, an imperial summons wasn't a request. It was fate. And that's the trap. The Vestal's vow didn't protect her from power. It only ensured that if her purity was taken, the system could still treat her as the problem. Think about that for a moment. A Vestal is trained her entire life to believe she is protected by sanctity. But sanctity is just a story. Society agrees to honor. And when the man at the top decides the story doesn't apply to him, the protection collapses like paper in rain. The sources don't preserve the setting or the method, but they do preserve the terror of the structure. a sacred institution, an emperor who recognized no boundary, and a silence afterward, because speaking could destroy what little safety a Vestal still had. The women couldn't speak of what happened. Speaking meant admitting the vow was broken, and broken vows meant the underground chamber, the lamp, the bread, the sealed stones, buried alive for a crime committed against them. So they stayed silent. They performed their duties. They tended the eternal flame. They walked through Rome with lictors, clearing their path while their insides were screaming. They lived in the cruel double life Rome demanded, sacred symbol by day, private ruin by night. Most took that secret to their graves. But one name survived: Rubria. Everything we can verify is painfully small: her name and the allegation. The rest is a reconstruction of what life inside that institution looked like, based on what we know about the Vestals, and what survived about Rubria cost her everything. We know almost nothing else about her. Not her family, not her age when she entered, not what she looked like, not what she dreamed about, not who she was before she became a symbol. The records that might have told us are gone, or were never preserved in the first place. Rome wanted her forgotten, but her name survived. Someone refused to let it disappear. Someone wrote it down. Someone carried it through time like contraband. Someone decided that even if the details were swallowed, the name would not be. Rubria. Imagine her before that night. She would have served for years, perhaps decades. Waking before dawn to tend the sacred flame, performing rituals she had memorized since childhood, walking through Rome with the quiet confidence of a woman who knew her place in the world. Protected, honored, untouchable. She believed in her duty. You don't survive decades of celibacy and sacrifice without belief. The flame she guarded kept Rome alive. Her purity protected the empire. Every prayer mattered. Every ritual held the world together. That faith sustained her through lonely nights. Through watching new girls arrive at the temple, frightened and confused, just as she once had been. Through aging in service while other women married and raised children and lived lives she would never know. The goddess had chosen her. That was enough. Then Nero summoned her. We don't know if she understood what was coming, if whispers reached the temple, if she saw fear in the faces of other Vestals who had already been pulled into the orbit of the palace, if she sensed that the city's protection was weaker than the law claimed. We only know she went, because refusing an emperor's summons meant death. And perhaps she still believed the sacred status would protect her. Perhaps she thought even Nero wouldn't dare. She was wrong. What happened that night, the sources don't detail. Suetonius names her as Nero's victim and gives no scene beyond the charge. But we know enough about Nero's court to understand how power could do this, and then demand silence afterward. Afterward, Rubria returned to the temple. Imagine that walk. Through Rome's streets, past guards who wouldn't meet her eyes, past the city that would cheer the emperor tomorrow, back to the sacred flame she had protected her entire life. A flame that now felt like mockery, a purity that no longer existed but would still be demanded. A vow that could condemn her even though she never chose to break it. She couldn't tell anyone, because the law didn't ask what was done to her. It asked what she was. And if her body had been changed by force, the institution could still treat her as if she had chosen it. That is how Rome kept the system intact, by turning victims into offenders, by turning you were harmed into you are guilty. So Rubria tended the flame, performed the rituals, wore the white robes, and carried the secret like a stone in her chest. Her story should have ended there, in silence like the others, anonymous, erased, forgotten. But Nero made a mistake. He thought power made him immortal. He forgot that even gods can bleed. The Vestals were only one boundary he crossed. Once he crossed that sacred line, no boundary remained. His reign became a catalogue of desecrations, each one more brazen than the last. He murdered his mother Agrippina, killed his wife Poppaea, turned human beings into props, turned the state into a stage. Rome watched its emperor descend into something beyond madness. Then came the fire. July 64 AD. Flames erupted near the Circus Maximus and spread for days. Neighborhoods vanished. Tens of thousands were displaced. Ancient buildings collapsed. The city's memory turned to smoke. And where was Nero? Stories say he performed, that he treated catastrophe like theater. Whether every detail of that rumor is true matters less than the fact that Rome believed it was plausible because he had trained them to see him that way. He blamed the Christians, rounded them up, covered them in animal skins, fed them to dogs, crucified them, burned them as living torches. A spectacle of punishment turned into garden lighting. Terror turned into decoration, and Rome wasn't fooled. Whispers spread that Nero himself wanted the fire, that he wanted land cleared for his massive new palace, the Domus Aurea, a golden house for a man who thought he was golden, a private world where he could rewrite reality without witnesses who mattered. The conspiracies began. Senators who had smiled through banquets began meeting in secret. Generals began counting their legions. Even the guard calculated how much loyalty was worth. In 68 AD, the provinces revolted. Gaul, Spain, Africa. One by one, the legions declared for other men. The Senate finally found courage. They declared Nero a public enemy, condemned him to death. The god emperor fled in the night, disguised in common clothes, a handful of servants, hiding outside Rome. The man who had commanded the world now cowered in a cellar, listening for hoofbeats. When he heard them approaching, Nero couldn't do it himself. He held a dagger to his throat, but his hands shook too badly. A servant helped him drive it home. His last words, according to Suetonius, were not remorse. They were vanity. What an artist dies in me. Not what a monster, not what a criminal. An artist. He was 30 years old. And here's the bitter truth history refuses to soften. Nero never faced justice for what Suetonius says he did to the Vestal Rubria. Never stood trial for it. Never suffered the punishment Rome claimed it reserved for men who violated the sacred. He escaped into death on his own terms, still mourning his own greatness. Rubria got no such escape. None of the Vestals did. They lived with what happened for years, for decades, in a system that demanded silence and called it purity. Nero escaped justice, but the institution he harmed remained. And what Rome did afterward reveals the final betrayal. After Nero's death, the Senate moved quickly. They declared condemnation of memory. Statues were torn down, names chiseled off, the palace stripped. Rome wanted to forget he had ever existed. But erasing a man is easy. Erasing what he did is harder. Whatever records existed didn't survive. Witnesses could be silenced or bought. Survivors had every reason to stay quiet, because speaking meant the institution could turn on them. Speaking meant the vow was publicly broken. Speaking meant the underground chamber waiting like a mouth. So they didn't speak. The Vestal Order continued as if nothing had happened. The flame kept burning. New girls were selected young, dressed in white, taught the prayers. The rituals resumed. The processions continued. Rome pretended its most sacred institution had never been defiled. But the women knew. The older Vestals who survived passed their silence to the younger ones, not through words, through flinches, through the way the room changed when certain names were mentioned, through the careful avoidance of topics that felt too sharp to touch. Trauma doesn't need language to transmit itself. It lives in bodies. It echoes through generations. For centuries more, the Vestals tended the flame. Centuries of women entering that temple, devoting their lives to sacred service, never hearing the full truth of what the institution had endured, because the truth was dangerous. The truth could kill them. The truth could turn their own holiness into their sentence. Then, in the late 4th century, under imperial Christian policy, the order was disbanded. The sacred fire went out. The last Vestals walked out of the temple and into history, taking whatever secrets remained with them. Rome finally completed the burial, but here's what Rome didn't understand. Silence is not erasure. Cover-ups are not cures. The truth doesn't disappear because you stop writing it down. It waits. 2,000 years later, the patterns still feel familiar. Powerful men violating those who cannot refuse. Institutions protecting their reputation instead of their victims. Records lost. Witnesses pressured. Survivors forced to choose between speaking and being punished for what was done to them. That machine never stopped running. It just changed addresses. Rubria's name survived because someone refused to let it disappear. One person, one act of preservation against an empire's determination to forget. That's all it takes. One voice that won't stay silent. One record hidden well enough. One refusal to participate in the burial. Rome thought it could erase this forever. It controlled the Senate, the armies, the temples, the histories. It thought it had absolute power over what would be remembered and what would be forgotten. They were wrong. Some flames refused to go out. Even sacred ones, even forbidden ones, even flames empires try to smother with silence and stone. Consider this flame rekindled. 2,000 years ago, Rubria had no voice, no platform, no way to tell the world what happened. She carried the weight inside a civilization that chose silence over justice. Today, thousands of people can hear her name. That matters more than it seems, because every time we dig up these buried stories, every time we speak the names that power tried to erase, we prove that silence doesn't last forever. The powerful can destroy records, they can bribe witnesses, they can threaten victims into submission, but they can't control the future. They can't stop someone 2,000 years later from finding the fragments they missed and piecing the truth back together. Rubria finally has her voice. So do the unnamed Vestals who suffered beside her. So do all the victims history tried to forget. If this story moved you, if it made you see power, silence, and sacred institutions differently, subscribe to Requiem of Thrones. Hit the bell so you never miss. When we uncover the next buried secret, we don't sanitize the past. We don't look away from the darkness. We drag it into the light where it belongs and drop a comment below. Tell us where in the world you're watching from today. Rome's empire stretched from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. Now this story travels even further. We want to know how far Rubria's voice has finally reached, because the girl who was silenced 2,000 years ago is finally being heard. See you in the next one.